My name is Elena Rodriguez, and for 26 years, my father believed I was wasting my life. He thought my obsession with languages was nothing more than an expensive hobby, a distraction from what he called real work. What he didn't know was that those 9 languages he mocked would one day save hundreds of lives and reshape the entire course of a war most people will never know was fought. The moment everything changed happened in a sterile briefing room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father, Sergeant Major Miguel Rodriguez, was there for what he thought was a routine commendation ceremony for logistics personnel. He'd spent 30 years in the Army, earned more ribbons than most soldiers see in a lifetime, and carried himself with the kind of rigid pride that comes from bleeding for your country. But when my commanding officer stepped to the podium and spoke 6 simple words, my father's world cracked open like an egg hitting concrete. "We need polyglot in the room." I still remember the way his face went pale, the way his eyes swept the room searching for anyone, other than his daughter to stand up. But it was me who rose from the back row, me who walked down that aisle in my Class A uniform, and me who finally showed him that all those years of studying languages in my bedroom weren't just academic curiosity. They were preparation for becoming one of the most effective intelligence officers the U.S. military has ever fielded. I grew up in a house where English was the language of duty, Spanish was the language of heritage, and silence was the language of disappointment. My father, Miguel Rodriguez, immigrated from El Salvador when he was 12. He'd crossed the desert with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a fierce determination to become American enough that no one would ever question his belonging. By the time I was born, he'd been in the Army for 8 years. Our house was a shrine to military precision. Boots polished to mirror shine, uniforms pressed with hospital corners, and a dining room table that doubled as a command center for his unit's administrative paperwork. Every surface was clean, every corner squared away, every conversation measured and purposeful. "Mica," he'd say, using one of the few Spanish words he allowed himself at home. "In this country you succeed by being twice as good and half as visible. You don't waste time on things that don't matter." I was 7 when I first discovered that the world was full of languages my father didn't speak. Mrs. Chen, our neighbor, spoke to her children in rapid Mandarin that sounded like music to my ears. The corner store owner, Miss Volkov, muttered in what I later learned was Russian whenever he was frustrated with the cash register. And Maria, our housekeeper, whispered prayers in a dialect of Spanish that my father claimed was uneducated. I started collecting words the way other children collected baseball cards. At 8, I convinced the librarian to let me check out a beginner's guide to French. I told my father it was for a school project, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd assigned it to myself. I practiced pronunciation in the bathroom with the shower running, whispering bonjour, come on, to my reflection until the sounds felt natural on my tongue. When my father discovered the book hidden under my mattress, his reaction was swift and decisive. "Elena, what is this nonsense?" He held the book like it was contaminated. "You speak English, you speak Spanish, that's all you need. This," he waved the book in the air. "This is what rich kids do when they have too much time and too little responsibility." I was 9 when I started learning German from cassette tapes I found at a garage sale. 10 when I discovered Italian through an old dictionary someone had thrown away. 11 when I began teaching myself Arabic using library books that smelled like cigarettes and desperation. Each new language felt like opening a door to a room I'd never known existed. Every grammar rule mastered. Every verb conjugated correctly. Every cultural nuance understood. It was like collecting keys to kingdoms my father couldn't even see. But in our house, my growing linguistic abilities were met with increasing skepticism. "She's smart," my father would tell relatives at family gatherings, "but she wastes her intelligence on useless things." Languages don't put food on the table, they don't pay for college, they don't serve your country. The irony, of course, was that Miguel Rodriguez had spent his entire adult life serving a country whose founding principle was that diversity of thought and background made it stronger. But he'd learned to survive by minimizing his differences, not celebrating them. In his mind, my passion for languages was a luxury he'd never been able to afford, and therefore one I shouldn't want. By the time I turned 12, I could hold basic conversations in 6 languages, but at home, I spoke only English, answered only when spoken to, and kept my growing linguistic abilities as hidden as a teenager's diary. The breaking point came during my freshman year of high school. I'd been selected for the academic decathlon team, partly because of my language skill. We were preparing for the state competition, and I'd volunteered to help translate some source materials from French and German. My coach, Mrs. Patterson, called home to tell my parents how impressed she was with my abilities. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, not knowing I was listening on the kitchen extension, "Elena has a remarkable gift. I've never seen a student pick up languages so naturally. Have you considered enrolling her in advanced placement courses, maybe even looking into summer immersion program?" My father's response was swift and final. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your interest in my daughter's education, but Elena needs to focus on practical skills, math, science, maybe business. Languages are a hobby, not a career path, and hobbies don't earn scholarship." After he hung up, he found me in my room, surrounded by textbooks and language dictionaries. "Elena, we need to talk." I looked up from my Arabic grammar exercises, my stomach already sinking. "Yes, sir. This language thing has gone too far. You're spending too much time on subjects that won't help you get into college or find a job. From now on, you focus on core subjects: math, science, English, history, the stuff that matters." "But Dad, I'm good at this, really good." "Mrs. Patterson says." "Mrs. Patterson doesn't pay the bills in this house." His voice carried the flat authority I'd learned not to challenge. "I've seen what happens to people who chase dreams instead of opportunities. They end up washing dishes or cleaning houses, no matter how many languages they speak." "What if languages could be an opportunity?" I asked quietly. "What if there are jobs where speaking multiple languages matters?" He sat down on my bed, and for a moment, his expression softened. This was the closest we'd come to a real conversation about my future in years. "Michia, listen to me. I love that you're smart. I love that you work hard, but the world doesn't care what you can do. It cares what you can prove you can do. And proving you can speak 9 languages doesn't mean anything if you can't also prove you can do math, science, and critical thinking." "But what if I could do both?" "Then you'd be wasting time you should spend becoming excellent at one thing instead of mediocre at everything." That night, I made a decision that would shape the next decade of my life. I wouldn't stop learning languages. I would just learn them in secret. High school became a carefully orchestrated double life. By day, I was Elena Rodriguez, honor roll student focused on AP calculus, chemistry, and computer science, subjects my father deemed practical. By night, I was a linguistic chameleon, absorbing languages through every possible channel. I discovered online language exchange programs, where I could practice conversation with native speakers around the world. I found podcasts in languages I'd never heard before. I joined international chat rooms, where English was forbidden, and communication happened in a beautiful chaos of Russian, Mandarin, Portuguese, and Arabic. My bedroom became a secret language laboratory. I used headphones constantly, telling my parents I was listening to study music. In reality, I was absorbing everything, from Bollywood soundtracks that taught me Hindi, to French news broadcasts that refined my accent. I kept physical notebooks hidden in a hollowed-out textbook, filled with vocabulary lists, grammar notes, and cultural observation. The most challenging part wasn't learning the languages, it was hiding how much I understood. During family gatherings, I'd listen to my aunts gossiping in rapid Spanish, understanding every word while pretending to be absorbed in my homework. When we went to restaurants, I'd hear conversations in languages I was studying, and have to bite my tongue to keep from joining in. Once, at a Chinese restaurant, I understood the waiters discussing how rude they thought another table was being. I wanted desperately to tell them in Mandarin that not all Americans were like that, but I couldn't risk my father overhearing. The closest I came to being discovered was during my junior year. I'd been practicing Portuguese with a Brazilian exchange student named Carlos, who attended a nearby high school. We'd started as language exchange partners. He helped me with Portuguese, I helped him with English, but we'd become genuine friends. We met at the public library twice a week, ostensibly to study for our respective classes. One afternoon, my father decided to pick me up early from what he thought was a regular study session. He walked into the library and found Carlos and me engaged in animated conversation entirely in Portuguese. I was explaining the difference between American and Brazilian attitudes toward family hierarchy, speaking fluently about cultural concepts I'd learned through months of careful study. My father stood in the doorway for nearly 30 seconds before I noticed him. When I looked up and saw his face, my Portuguese faltered mid-sentence. Helena, car, now. The drive home was silent, except for the radio playing some generic pop song that felt inappropriately cheerful. When we pulled into our driveway, my father turned off the engine but didn't get out. How long have you been speaking Portuguese? I considered lying, but something in his tone told me he already knew the answer wouldn't matter. About 8 months. And how many other languages are you learning that I don't know about? I stared at my hands, including Portuguese. 7. He was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd heard me. 7 languages. Yes, sir. While maintaining a 4.0 GPA in your actual classes. Yes, sir. Elena. He turned to look at me directly. Why? It was such a simple question, but I realized I'd never been asked it before. Not why was I learning languages, but why was I keeping it secret? Why was I living this double life? Why was I working so hard at something I couldn't share with the people who were supposed to love me most? Because I'm good at it, I said finally. Because when I learn a new language, it's like discovering a new way of thinking. Because I want to understand how people see the world different. Because, I stopped, not sure how to finish. Because I think understanding people is important, even people who are different from us, especially people who are different from us. My father was quiet again. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than I'd expected. Misha, I don't understand why you want to fill your head with all these different ways of talking, but I see that you work hard at it. I see that it makes you happy, and I see that you're still succeeding at everything else. I felt a flutter of hope. So I can keep learning. You can keep learning. But Alina, you need to understand something. The world is not kind to people who are different. The world is not kind to people who stand out. I spent my whole life learning to fit in, to belong, to not give anyone a reason to question whether I deserve to be here. These languages you're learning, they make you different. They make you stand out. And that can be dangerous. What if standing out could be a good thing? He smiled, but it was sad. Then you're braver than your old man. That conversation changed something between us. My father didn't start celebrating my linguistic abilities, but he stopped actively discouraging them. It was progress, even if it wasn't acceptance. What I didn't know was that in 3 years, those 7 languages would become 9, and those 9 languages would become the reason the United States military recruited me for one of the most sensitive intelligence operations in modern history. But first, I had to graduate high school and figure out what to do with a passion my father still didn't understand. Senior year brought college applications, scholarship deadlines, and the first real test of whether my linguistic abilities could actually translate into practical opportunity. My father had made his position clear. I could apply to any school I wanted, as long as I majored in something useful: engineering, pre-med, business, or computer science. Languages can be a minor, he'd said, but your major needs to be something that guarantees a job. I applied to 12 universities with strong STEM programs, writing essays about my passion for biomedical engineering and my dream of developing medical devices for underserved communities. It wasn't entirely false. I was genuinely interested in how technology could solve global health problems. But I was also 18 years old, and terrified of disappointing the man who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities he'd never had. The acceptance letters started arriving in March. I got into 8 of the 12 schools, including my top choice Georgia Institute of Technology. My father was proud, my mother cried, and our extended family treated me like I'd already graduated with honor. But the letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday in April, addressed to me personally, with a return address I didn't recognize. Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, Monterey, California. I opened it in my bedroom, expecting some kind of recruitment brochure. Instead, I found a formal letter of invitation to participate in something called the National Security Language Initiative for Youth, a program I'd never heard of and certainly never applied to. Dear Rodriguez, based on your performance on standardized language assessments and recommendations from academic advisors, you have been selected as a candidate for the NSLIY Critical Language Scholarship Program. This highly competitive program provides full funding for intensive language study abroad, followed by potential pathways into national security career. Your linguistic profile indicates advanced proficiency in 7 languages, with demonstrated aptitude for rapid acquisition of additional languages. This combination of skills is extremely rare and highly valued in the intelligence community. If selected, you would spend 1 year in intensive study of a critical language. We recommend Arabic or Mandarin based on current strategic needs, followed by optional enrollment in the Reserve Officers Training Corps at your chosen university. Please note that this program has a 98% placement rate into federal intelligence agencies upon graduation. We would like to schedule a phone interview at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Colonel Sarah Chen, Director, Language Acquisition and Cultural Intelligence. I read the letter 3 times before it sank in. Someone in the government had been watching my language learning. Someone thought my skills were valuable enough to offer me a full scholarship and a guaranteed career path. Someone thought my father was wrong. The phone interview was scheduled for the following Friday. I told my parents I was meeting with a college admissions counselor, which wasn't technically a lie. Colonel Chen called exactly at the appointed time, and her voice carried the kind of crisp authority I'd only heard from my father's military colleagues. Elena, I'm going to be direct with you. We've been tracking your linguistic development through various channels: online language exchange programs, library usage patterns, academic performance metrics. You've taught yourself 7 languages to near fluency while maintaining exceptional grades in STEM subjects. That combination is almost unprecedented. How did you know about my language learning? I haven't exactly been public about it. The intelligence community notices patterns, Elena, especially patterns that suggest someone has the cognitive flexibility and cultural curiosity we value. Your digital footprint shows someone systematically studying languages from 7 different language families, engaging with native speakers across multiple continents, and demonstrating genuine cultural competency, not just vocabulary memorization. I felt simultaneously impressed and slightly unnerved that they'd been paying such close attention. What exactly would this program involve? 1 year of intensive language immersion, think 12 hours a day of classes, cultural training and practical application. You'd emerge functionally fluent in either Arabic or Mandarin, at a level that typically takes 3 to 4 years to achieve. After that, you'd complete your undergraduate degree in any field you choose, with full financial support. Upon graduation, you'd have guaranteed placement in an intelligence agency where your linguistic skills would be your primary job function, and the military component. ROTC participation is optional but strongly encouraged. Many of our language specialists serve as military officers, though some work as civilian contractors or direct government employees. The important thing is that you'd be using your languages professionally, not just as a hobby. The word hobby hit me like a slap. It was exactly what my father had called my language learning for years. Colonel Chen, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you really think language skills are that valuable, in terms of actual national security? There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Elena, 3 months ago, a 19-year-old Navy linguist prevented what could have been the largest terrorist attack on American soil since. She overheard a conversation in a Somali dialect so obscure that only 12 people in the entire U.S. intelligence community are qualified to translate it. Her language skills didn't just help solve a case, they saved lives. I felt something shift in my chest. How many people can do what I do? Speak 9 languages fluently. Maybe 200 people in the entire country speak 9 languages fluently, and have the analytical intelligence to work in national security. Maybe 29 languages fluently, have the analytical intelligence, and are young enough to train for a full career in this field. How many? As of right now, you. The conversation lasted another 30 minutes. Colonel Chen explained the application process, the security clearance requirements, and the commitment involved. When I hung up, I sat in my room, staring at the acceptance letter from Georgia Tech, and the invitation letter from the Defense Language Institute. I had 2 paths in front of me, the safe route my father wanted, and the unknown route that valued the skills he'd spent years telling me were worthless. That night at dinner, I decided to test the water. Dad, hypothetically, what would you think if someone offered me a scholarship specifically for language skills? My father looked up from his rice and beans. What kind of scholarship? A government scholarship, for people who are good at learning languages. He set down his fork. Elena, the government doesn't give out scholarships for hobbies. What if it wasn't a hobby? What if language skills were actually useful for national security? My mother, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up for the first time. Miguel, remember your friend Roberto, the one who works at the State Department? He's always talking about how they need more translators. That's different, my father said. Roberto translates documents. That's not a career, that's contract work. But what if it could be a career? What if there were government jobs specifically for people who speak multiple languages? My father studied my face, and I could see him trying to figure out if this was hypothetical, or if something specific had happened. Miguel, if such a job existed, and I'm not saying it does, it would probably involve traveling to dangerous places, working with classified information, and putting yourself at risk in ways that your old man would not be comfortable with. But would it be a real job? A job that meant— He was quiet for a long moment. If the government was willing to pay someone specifically for language skills, then yes, it would be a real job. But Elena, just because something is a real job doesn't mean it's a good job for you. That night, I called Colonel Chen back. I'm interested, I told her. But I need to know, will this actually make my father proud of me? She laughed, a sound that was somehow both warm and professional. Elena, by the time you finish this program, your father won't just be proud of you. He'll understand that you've been preparing for something important your entire life, even when neither of you knew what it was. 2 weeks later, I was officially accepted into the NSLIY program. I would spend the summer between high school and college in Jordan, studying intensive Arabic. I would defer my admission to Georgia Tech for 1 year, and I would begin a journey that would lead me to become one of the most effective intelligence officers in the U.S. military. But first, I had to tell my father that I was turning down a traditional college path, to pursue the one thing he'd spent years telling me was pointless. The letter from the Defense Language Institute sat on our kitchen table for 3 days before I worked up the courage to show it to my parents. I'd been carrying it in my backpack, reading and rereading the scholarship details, trying to figure out how to present this opportunity in a way my father might actually support. When I finally put the letter next to his coffee cup on Saturday morning, his reaction was immediate and explosive. Absolutely not. Dad, you haven't even read the whole thing yet. I've read enough. They want to send my 18-year-old daughter to the Middle East for a year to study Arabic, in Jordan. Do you have any idea what's happening in that part of the world right now? My mother picked up the letter and began reading more carefully. Miguel, it says here that the program has excellent safety records, and it's a full scholarship, room, board, tuition, everything. I don't care if they pay her $1 million. I'm not sending my daughter to a war zone so she can learn another useless language. Arabic isn't useless, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It's one of the most strategically important languages in the world right now. Strategically important to who? Elena, you're 18 years old. You don't understand how dangerous the world is. You don't understand what happens to young American women in countries where they don't respect. Countries where they don't respect what? Dad? Women? American? Spanish speakers? My own voice was getting sharper. Or are you just scared that I might be good at something you don't understand? The kitchen went silent except for the humming of the refrigerator. My father stood up slowly, his face dark with an anger I'd rarely seen directed at me. What did you just say to me? I said, maybe you're scared that I might be good at something you don't understand. Because God forbid your daughter be good at something that doesn't fit into your narrow definition of what matters. Elena Rodriguez, you need to watch your tone. No, Dad, you need to listen. For once in my life, you need to actually listen to what I'm telling you instead of just dismissing it, because it doesn't match what you think I should want. My mother put her hand on my father's arm. Miguel, let her finish. I've been learning languages for 10 years. 10 years, Dad. While you've been telling me it's a waste of time, I've become functionally fluent in 9 languages. 9. And now for the first time ever, someone is telling me that what I can do actually matters. That it's valuable, that it could be a career. A career doing what, Elena? Translating menus? Tour guiding? Intelligence work? National security? preventing terrorist attacks, saving lives. My father laughed, but there was no humor in it. Elena, you've been watching too many movies. Real intelligence work isn't glamorous. It's dangerous, it's secretive, and it's no place for a young woman who's never even been outside the United States. How do you know what real intelligence work is like? Because I've been in the military for 25 years, and I've seen what happens to people who think they're going to change the world by playing with languages and codes. They end up as targets. They end up dead. They end up breaking their parents' hearts because they thought they were invincible. This was the first time my father had ever expressed genuine fear for my safety, and it caught me off guard. But I was too angry to back down. So your solution is for me to hide? To play it safe? To do exactly what you did? Minimize who I am, so that I can fit into someone else's definition of acceptable? My solution is for you to be smart. To go to college, get a degree in something practical, and build a life that doesn't require you to put yourself in harm's way. What if I don't want a safe life? What if I want a life that matters? Your life already matters, Elena. It matters to me and your mother. It doesn't need to matter to the whole world. We stared at each other across the kitchen table, and I realized we were having two completely different arguments. He was arguing about safety, about protecting me from a dangerous world. I was arguing about purpose, about being allowed to use my abilities in meaningful ways. My mother, who had been reading the scholarship materials more carefully, finally spoke up. Elena, it says here that after the year abroad, you'd still go to college. You'd just have a guaranteed job waiting for you when you graduate. A guaranteed job doing what? My father demanded. I looked at him directly. Using my language skills to protect the country you've spent your entire adult life serving. That stopped him cold. What does that mean? It means that instead of learning languages as a hobby, I'd learn them as a professional skill. It means that instead of hiding what I can do, I'd use it to help keep America safe. It means that instead of wasting my abilities, I'd finally get to use them in service to something bigger than myself. My father sat back down, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked uncertain instead of angry. Elena, do you have any idea what you're talking about? Do you understand what a career in intelligence actually involves? I understand that it involves using analytical thinking, cultural knowledge, and language skills to gather and interpret information that helps protect national security. I understand that it involves working with classified material and maintaining security clearances. I understand that it sometimes involves personal risk. And you want that? You want a life where you can't tell your family what you do for a living, where you might have to travel to dangerous places and deal with dangerous people, where one mistake could get you killed or get other people killed. I thought about his question seriously before answering. Dad, I want a life where my abilities matter. I want to wake up every day, knowing that what I do contributes to something important. I want to use the skills I've spent 10 years developing, instead of pretending they don't exist. And yes, if that involves some risk, I'm willing to accept that risk. My father was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all morning. Elena, you're my only daughter. You're the smartest person I know. You're the best thing your mother and I ever did together. The idea of you putting yourself in danger, even for good reasons, terrifies me. I know, Dad, but the idea of spending my whole life hiding who I am terrifies me more. He picked up the scholarship letter and read it again, more carefully this time. This program, it's run by the military. It's run by the Defense Language Institute, which is a military school, but participants aren't automatically enlisted. Some become military officers, some become civilian employees, some become contractors. And you would choose, I would choose based on where I could be most effective. My mother, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Miguel, remember when you first enlisted? Your father thought you were throwing your life away. He said the military was no place for a smart boy from El Salvador, that you should focus on blending in and building a quiet life. My father nodded slowly, but you knew better, she continued. You knew that serving your country was important, even if it involved risk. Even if your father didn't understand. That was different. Was it, or is it just that you understand military service but you don't understand intelligence work? My father looked at me, then at my mother, then back at the letter. If I say yes to this, you promise me 3 things. What 3 things? First, you finish college. No matter what happens with this program, you get your degree. I promise. Second, you keep us informed about where you are and what you're doing, within whatever security restrictions you have to follow. I promise. Third, if at any point you decide this isn't what you want, you come home. No shame, no guilt, no pressure to continue just because you started. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. I promise all 3 things. He was quiet for another long moment. Elena, I still think you're making a mistake. I still think you're choosing a path that's unnecessarily dangerous and complicated. But you're 18 years old, you're smart enough to make your own decisions, and you're brave enough to face the consequences. Does that mean yes? That means I'll sign the parental consent forms. But Elena, yes? You call me from Jordan every week, and if anyone tries to put you in a situation that doesn't feel safe, you get out immediately and you call me. Understood? Understood. 3 months later I was on a plane to Amman, Jordan, beginning the most intensive year of education I'd ever experienced. I would study Arabic 12 hours a day, live with a Jordanian host family, and immerse myself completely in a culture my father was convinced would be hostile to everything I represent. What neither of us knew was that this year would transform me from a talented language student into someone capable of preventing international incidents through the precise application of cultural knowledge and linguistic skill. But that revelation was still years away, waiting for a moment in a briefing room at Fort Bragg when my commanding officer would finally speak my operational name aloud, and my father would realize that his daughter had become exactly the kind of soldier he'd always claimed to respect. Jordan in August felt like stepping into an oven wrapped in sandpaper. The heat was unlike anything I'd experienced in Georgia, dry and relentless, turning every breath into a conscious effort. But the heat was nothing compared to the linguistic immersion that began on my first day at the Defense Language Institute's partner facility in Amman. 12 hours a day of Arabic instruction doesn't sound overwhelming until you realize it means 12 hours of thinking in a completely different grammatical structure, absorbing cultural concepts that don't translate directly into English, and rewiring your brain to process information in patterns that feel initially foreign and eventually natural. My host family, the Khalils, spoke no English at home. This wasn't an accident, it was part of the program's design. From the moment I walked through their front door, every interaction had to happen in Arabic, or through elaborate gestures that usually ended with everyone laughing at my attempts to mime concepts like homesick or jet lag. Omar Khalil was a retired professor of linguistics at the University of Jordan. His wife, Fatima, taught elementary school. They had 2 daughters, Layla, who was my age and studying engineering, and Zahra, who was 16 and possessed the teenager's universal gift for finding humor in everything. Within a week, they'd adopted me as a 3rd daughter, correcting my grammar with the same loving exasperation they showed their own children. Elena, Omar would say in careful Arabic, you speak like you're translating from English in your head. Stop translating, start thinking. It was easier said than done. For the first month, every conversation was an exhausting exercise in mental gymnastics. I'd hear a question, translate it into English, formulate a response in English, translate that response into Arabic, then by the time I got the words out, the conversation had moved on. But something magical happened around week 6. I was helping Fatima prepare dinner, listening to her explain the cultural significance of sharing meals in Jordanian families, when I realized I hadn't translated a single word. I was thinking in Arabic, understanding in Arabic, and responding in Arabic without any English intermediary. Good, Omar said when I told him about this breakthrough. Now you are not learning Arabic, you are becoming Arabic. The academic portion of the program was equally intense. We studied not just grammar and vocabulary, but history, religion, politics, and cultural nuances that could make the difference between diplomatic success and international incident. I learned that Arabic isn't just one language, it's a family of dialects that can vary dramatically between regions, and sometimes between neighborhoods within the same city. More importantly, I learned that language is just the surface layer of communication. The real skill is cultural fluency, understanding not just what people are saying, but what they're not saying, what they assume you know, and what your responses signal about your own cultural background and intention. 3 months into the program, our instructors introduced practical application. We began working with simulated intelligence scenarios, intercepted communications that needed translation, cultural briefings for fictional diplomatic missions, and role-playing exercises, where we had to navigate complex social situations while maintaining appropriate cover identity. It was during one of these exercises that I first understood what my career might actually look like. The scenario involved a simulated marketplace in Damascus, where I was supposed to be an American journalist investigating reports of chemical weapons production. My mission was to gather information from local vendors and residents, without arousing suspicion or putting anyone at risk. What made the exercise challenging wasn't the language. By that point, my Arabic was strong enough to handle casual conversations with native speakers. The challenge was cultural navigation. How do you ask sensitive questions without seeming like a spy? How do you express skepticism without insulting someone's intelligence? How do you show respect for local customs while maintaining your cover identity? I spent 2 hours in the simulated marketplace, moving from vendor to vendor, building relationships through small talk before gradually steering conversations toward the topics that mattered. I bought tea from an elderly man who'd lived in the area for 60 years. I discussed rising food prices with a woman selling vegetables. I listened to teenagers complaining about unemployment and limited opportunities. Slowly, carefully, I built a network of casual acquaintances who began sharing information voluntarily. The elderly tea vendor mentioned increased truck traffic at night near the industrial district. The vegetable seller talked about new construction that had blocked her usual supply routes. The teenagers complained about factory jobs that paid well but required signing confidentiality agreements. By the end of the exercise, I'd gathered enough information to confirm the suspected chemical weapons facility, without asking a single direct question about chemical weapons. Everything I learned came through patient relationship building and careful cultural observation. Outstanding work, my instructor said during the debrief. You demonstrated exactly the kind of approach that succeeds in real-world intelligence gathering. You built trust, respected cultural boundaries, and extracted sensitive information through legitimate social interaction. It didn't feel like intelligence work, I admitted. It felt like being a good neighbor. That's exactly the point, Elena. The most effective intelligence officers are the ones who can blend into local communities and gather information through genuine human connection. What you did today, that's your career in a nutshell. For the first time since arriving in Jordan, I felt like I truly understood what I was training for. This wasn't about dramatic spy scenarios or high-tech surveillance equipment. It was about using language skills and cultural knowledge to build bridges between communities and extract information that could help prevent conflicts before they started. The second half of my year in Jordan focused on advanced applications, translating intercepted communications, analyzing cultural context in political speeches, and practicing rapid dialect identification. We worked with actual intelligence materials, obviously declassified and historical, but real nonetheless. I translated communiques from the Iranian Revolution, analyzed speeches by various Middle Eastern leaders, and studied the linguistic patterns that intelligence analysts use to verify the authenticity of communication. But the most valuable part of my education happened outside the classroom. During the 8 months I lived with the Khalil family, Omar and Fatima treated me like their own daughter, which meant I was expected to participate in all aspects of family life. I attended extended family gatherings, where I met cousins and uncles who worked in everything from engineering to journalism to government service. I helped with household chores while listening to discussions about regional politics, economic challenges, and social changes happening throughout the Middle East. I learned that Arabic hospitality isn't just about politeness. It's a sophisticated social system that allows people to demonstrate respect, build alliances, and gather information simultaneously. I discovered that family relationships in Jordan extend far beyond blood relatives to include networks of friends, neighbors, and professional colleagues who function as informal intelligence networks, sharing information about everything from job opportunities to political development. Most importantly, I learned that effective cross-cultural communication requires not just linguistic skill, but genuine respect for the people you're trying to understand. The Americans who succeeded in building relationships with local communities were the ones who approached those communities as equals with valuable knowledge and perspective. The Americans who failed were the ones who assumed their own cultural framework was superior and expected everyone else to adapt to them. By the time I returned to the United States in June, I was functionally fluent in Arabic at a level that typically takes 4 years of university study to achieve. But more than that, I'd developed what my instructors called cultural intuition, the ability to read social situations, understand unspoken communication, and navigate complex cultural dynamics without causing offense or misunderstanding. My father met me at the airport in Atlanta, and I could see him trying to assess whether his daughter had been fundamentally changed by a year in the Middle East. The truth was, I had been changed, but not in the ways he'd feared. I was more confident, more culturally aware, and more certain than ever that I wanted to pursue a career in intelligence work. How was it? He asked as we drove home. Life-changing, I told him. In the best possible way. Do you still want to do this? The intelligence career. I thought about Omar Khalil patiently correcting my grammar mistakes, about Fatima teaching me to cook traditional Jordanian dishes, while explaining the cultural significance of shared meals, about Layla helping me understand how young Jordanian women navigated expectations about education and career advancement, about Zara teaching me Arabic slang that wasn't in any textbook but was essential for understanding conversations between teenagers. More than ever I said, but Dad, it's not what you think it is. It's not about secrets and danger and spy games. It's about understanding people. It's about building bridges between different communities. It's about using language skills to prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into conflict. My father was quiet for several miles. And you're good at it? I'm really good at it. Then I guess we need to talk about college. The conversation that followed would determine whether I entered university as a traditional pre-med student, or as someone preparing for a very specific and unusual career in intelligence work. What my father didn't know was that my performance in Jordan had already attracted attention from recruiters, who were prepared to offer me opportunities most college students couldn't imagine. But those opportunities would only become relevant after I'd proven myself in the next phase of my education, 4 years of college during which I would continue developing the skills that would eventually make me one of the most valuable intelligence assets the U.S. military had ever trained. The question was whether my father was ready to support that journey, or whether we were about to have another argument about the value of choosing the unconventional path. I entered Georgia Tech as a double major in international affairs and computer science with a minor in Middle Eastern studies. On paper it looked like a scattered academic approach. In reality, it was carefully designed preparation for a career in modern intelligence work, where technical skills and cultural knowledge were equally valuable. My father had finally agreed to support my unconventional path, but he'd insisted on certain conditions. If you're going to do this intelligence work, he'd said, you need to understand technology, politics, and strategy, not just languages. Languages get you in the door, but analysis and technical skills keep you alive. He was right, though I wouldn't fully understand how right until years later. My freshman year was an exercise in balancing academic excellence with continued language development. I was taking 18 credit hours of coursework, while maintaining proficiency in the 9 languages I'd already learned, and adding Russian and Portuguese through weekend immersion programs. Most of my classmates thought I was either incredibly dedicated or completely insane. The truth was, I'd become addicted to the cognitive challenge of switching between different linguistic frameworks. Speaking Arabic required different grammatical structures than Russian. Portuguese demanded different cultural assumptions than Mandarin. Each language activated different parts of my brain, and moving between them felt like a mental workout that kept my analytical skills sharp. But it was during my sophomore year that I first got a glimpse of how these skills would actually be used in the field. Professor Elena Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared name, taught a course called Intelligence Analysis and Practice, that was technically open to all students, but practically designed for the small number of us who were serious about intelligence career. The course involved analyzing real intelligence scenarios using declassified materials from various historical incidents. Our midterm assignment was to analyze communications intercepted during the Iranian hostage crisis, and identify patterns that might have helped predict or prevent the incident. We were given transcripts of diplomatic cables, records of phone conversations, and summaries of face-to-face meetings, all in their original languages. Most of my classmates focused on the English language materials, analyzing political rhetoric and diplomatic positioning. I requested access to the original Persian and Arabic communications, which required special permission and additional security clearance. What I found was fascinating and disturbing. The English language materials showed Iranian officials making statements that seemed deliberately provocative and unreasonable, but the Persian and Arabic communications revealed a much more complex situation. Iranian officials were actually trying to find face-saving exits from the crisis, but they were using culturally specific language that wasn't being accurately translated or interpreted by American diplomats. In several instances, Iranian officials had made statements that in Persian cultural context were clear signals of willingness to negotiate, but these statements had been translated literally into English without cultural context, making them sound like threats rather than diplomatic overtures. My analysis suggested that the hostage crisis could have been resolved months earlier if American negotiators had understood the cultural subtext of Iranian communications and responded with appropriate cultural sensitivity. Professor Rodriguez read my analysis with increasing interest and asked me to stay after class. Elena, this is graduate-level work, possibly PhD-level work. How did you develop this kind of cultural insight into Iranian diplomatic language? I explained my background in linguistics and my year in Jordan, where I'd learned to read cultural subtext in Arabic communications. Have you considered accelerating your academic timeline? There are programs that would allow you to complete your undergraduate degree in 3 years and move directly into specialized graduate training. What kind of specialized training? The kind that leads to careers doing exactly what you just did with this assignment, analyzing cross-cultural communications to prevent international incidents. That conversation led to a meeting with Colonel James Mitchell, a military liaison, who recruited students for specialized intelligence programs. Colonel Mitchell was unlike any recruiter I'd ever met. Instead of trying to sell me on the excitement or importance of intelligence work, he asked detailed questions about my linguistic abilities, my cultural knowledge, and my analytical approach to complex problems. Elena, I'm going to be direct with you. The intelligence community has a critical shortage of people who can do what you just did with the Iranian communications analysis. We have plenty of translators who can convert words from one language to another. We have very few people who can interpret cultural meaning, analyze cross-cultural miscommunication, and develop strategies for preventing diplomatic failures. What would that career actually look like? It would involve working with both military and civilian intelligence agencies to analyze communications between the United States and countries where cultural misunderstanding could lead to critic. Sometimes you'd work at a desk, analyzing intercepted communications. Sometimes you'd work in the field, serving as a cultural advisor to diplomatic or military teams. Sometimes you'd work undercover, gathering information in situations where your language skills and cultural knowledge would allow you to blend into local communities. And the training? 3 years of undergraduate work, you'd accelerate your timeline and graduate early. 2 years of specialized graduate training in intelligence analysis and fieldwork, then direct placement in an intelligence agency where you'd begin working on real operations immediately. It was an attractive offer, but it meant making a commitment to a career path I still didn't fully understand. Colonel Mitchell, can I ask you something? Of course. What's the most important thing someone like me would actually do? What's the mission that makes all this training worthwhile? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Elena, 3 weeks ago, a miscommunication between American forces and local tribal leaders in Afghanistan led to a firefight that killed 6 people, 3 American soldiers and 3 Afghan civilians. The miscommunication happened because our interpreter translated the words correctly, but missed the cultural context that would have revealed the tribal leader was actually trying to help us, not threaten us. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's the kind of incident you could have prevented. Your job would be to make sure American forces understand not just what foreign contacts are saying, but what they mean, what they're not saying, and how our responses will be interpreted within their cultural framework. How often do those kinds of miscommunications happen? More often than we like to admit, and less often than they used to, because we're getting better at training people like you to prevent them. That night, I called my father and explained the accelerated training program. 3 years of college instead of 4, then 2 years of specialized training, then immediate placement in an intelligence agency. It's an opportunity to start my career at age 23 instead of 25. And you want to do this? I think I do. But Dad, it would mean committing to a career path before I'm completely sure what it involves. It would mean making decisions now that would affect the rest of my life. My father was quiet for a long time. Misha, when I joined the army, I didn't know what my career would look like. I just knew that I wanted to serve my country and I was willing to work hard to be good at it. Everything else I figured out as I went along. Do you think that's what I should do? I think you should follow your instinct. Your instincts have been right about everything so far, about learning languages, about the Jordan program, about this being a real career path. If your instincts say this accelerated program is the right choice, then trust them. And if I'm wrong, then you'll figure out how to be right. That's what smart people do. I accepted the accelerated program and graduated from Georgia Tech in 3 years with a double major and near perfect grades. More importantly, I graduated with a clear sense of mission and a comprehensive understanding of how linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and analytical thinking could be combined to serve national security interests. My graduation ceremony was small and private. Most accelerated program participants were bound by security agreements that limited public recognition of their achievement. But my parents were there, and when they called my name to receive my diploma, my father stood up and applauded like I'd just won an Olympic medal. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. Alina, I need to tell you something. I still don't completely understand what you're going to be doing. I still worry about the risks, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just for your grades or your achievements, but for having the courage to pursue something you believe in even when it wasn't easy. Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me. And Alina, when you're out there doing whatever it is you're going to be doing, remember that you're not just representing yourself, you're representing our family, our community, and everyone who believes that smart young women can make the world a safer place. 2 weeks later, I reported to Fort Belvoir, Virginia for the 2 years of specialized training that would transform me from a talented student into a professional intelligence officer. What I didn't know was that during those 2 years I would develop skills that would make me one of the most valuable assets in the U.S. intelligence community, capable of preventing international incidents through precise application of linguistic knowledge and cultural insight. And I definitely didn't know that those skills would eventually be demonstrated in front of my father during a ceremony that would forever change how he thought about the daughter he'd once accused of wasting her time on useless languages. The United States Army Intelligence and Security Command training facility at Fort Belvoir looked like a cross between a college campus and a high-security prison. Manicured lawns and modern academic buildings were surrounded by multiple layers of fencing, checkpoints, and surveillance equipment that reminded every student that what happened here was serious enough to require protection from foreign intelligence services. My class consisted of 12 students, all with similar backgrounds, exceptional academic records, multiple language proficiencies, and psychological profiles, indicating high stress tolerance and cultural adaptability. We came from different universities and different military branches, but we shared a common mission: becoming the kind of intelligence officers who could prevent conflicts through understanding rather than resolve them through force. The training program was divided into 4 phases: analytical methodology, cultural immersion, fieldwork simulation, and operational deployment preparation, each phase built on the previous one, gradually transforming us from talented students into professional intelligence operators. Phase 1. Analytical methodology. The first 6 months focused on developing systematic approaches to intelligence analysis. We learned to break down complex political situations into manageable components, identify patterns in seemingly unrelated information, and draw accurate conclusions from incomplete data. Our primary instructor was Dr. Sarah Kim, a former CIA analyst who'd spent 15 years working in East Asian operations before transitioning to training. Dr. Kim had the gift of making intelligence analysis feel like solving puzzles rather than memorizing procedure. Intelligence analysis, she told us on our first day, is not about knowing everything. It's about knowing which questions to ask and how to find reliable answers quickly. We worked with real intelligence scenarios from recent conflicts, always with names and locations changed for security purposes. We analyzed communications patterns between terrorist cells, tracked financial flows through international money laundering networks, and studied the social dynamics that led to political instability in various countries. But the most valuable part of Phase 1 was learning to think like the people we would be analyzing. Before you can understand someone's communications, Dr. Kim explained, You need to understand their worldview. What do they consider normal? What do they fear? What motivates them? What cultural assumptions shape how they interpret events? We spent weeks studying case studies where American intelligence officers had misinterpreted foreign communications because they'd applied American cultural assumptions to non-American We learned about diplomatic failures that occurred because negotiators didn't understand the cultural significance of timing, hierarchy, and face-saving in different societies. My linguistic background gave me advantages in some areas, but I quickly discovered that speaking a language fluently didn't automatically mean understanding the culture that produced it. Arabic as spoken in Jordan was different from Arabic as spoken in Iraq, not just in dialect but in cultural context. The same words could carry completely different implications depending on regional history, religious traditions, and political circumstances. Dr. Kim pushed us to develop what she called cultural empathy, the ability to understand how situations looked from other people's perspectives without necessarily agreeing with those perspectives. Your job, she said, is not to judge whether someone's worldview is right or wrong. Your job is to understand that worldview well enough to predict how they'll react to various situations and how they'll interpret your actions. Phase 2, Cultural Immersion. The second phase involved intensive cultural training for specific regions where we might eventually be deployed. Based on my language skills and the current strategic priorities, I was assigned to Middle Eastern and Central Asian specialization. This phase was taught by a rotating series of experts, former diplomats, anthropologists, journalists, and intelligence officers who'd spent years living and working in the regions we were studying. Each instructor brought different perspectives on the same cultures, helping us understand that every society contained multiple viewpoints, and that successful intelligence work required understanding those internal variations. We studied everything from religious traditions and family structures to economic systems and political hierarchies. We learned to recognize the social cues that indicated when someone was being polite versus when they were being honest, when they were expressing individual opinions versus representing group positions, and when they were testing our knowledge versus genuinely seeking information. But the most intense part of Phase 2 was what our instructors called assumption hunting, the process of identifying and eliminating the unconscious cultural assumptions that could lead to analytical errors. Every day we were presented with scenarios designed to trigger our cultural bias. We would analyze situations, draw conclusions, and then have those conclusions systematically challenged by instructors who forced us to examine our underlying assumptions. For example, we might be asked to analyze a political speech by a Middle Eastern leader and assess the likelihood that he was planning military action against a neighboring country. Our initial analysis might focus on the explicit threats contained in the speech. Then our instructors would point out cultural context we'd missed. Perhaps the speech was delivered on a religious holiday when symbolic rhetoric was expected, or perhaps the specific phrases used were actually traditional diplomatic language indicating willingness to negotiate. Every culture, explained Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a Syrian-American anthropologist, has its own methods for saying things without saying them directly. Your job is to learn those methods well enough to understand what's really being communicated. Hassan taught us about the concept of face in various cultures, the social importance of maintaining dignity and respect in public contexts. He showed us how many international conflicts were actually disputes about respect and recognition, rather than material interests, and how understanding those dynamics could help prevent minor disagreements from escalating into major confrontation. Phase 3, Fieldwork Simulation. The third phase was the most intensive and the most realistic. We worked in simulated foreign environments, complete with role-playing actors who spoke native languages and followed authentic cultural script. These simulations were designed to test our ability to gather information, build relationships, and navigate complex social situations while maintaining appropriate cover identities. The simulation facility was impressive, multiple mock environments that could be reconfigured to represent different countries and situations. One week we might be working in a simulated Afghan village, gathering information about insurgent activity while posing as aid worker. The next week we might be in a mock Lebanese university, building relationships with students and faculty while investigating potential terrorist recruitment. Each simulation was carefully monitored and critiqued. Instructors observed our interactions from hidden locations and provided detailed feedback on everything from our language usage and cultural sensitivity to our personal security practices and information gathering techniques. My first major simulation was set in a mock Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. My mission was to identify and assess potential security threats among the refugee population, while maintaining a cover identity as a humanitarian aid worker. The challenge was gathering intelligence without exploiting vulnerable people or violating their trust. The simulation taught me that effective intelligence work required genuine respect for the people you were trying to understand. The refugees, played by Syrian American actors who'd actually lived through similar experiences, could immediately distinguish between aid workers who cared about their well-being and those who were just gathering information. Building trust required demonstrating genuine concern for their needs and treating them as individuals with valuable knowledge and perspectives, rather than just sources of intelligence. Over 6 months of simulations, I learned to gather information through patient relationship building, to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources, and to analyze the social dynamics that influenced how information flowed through different communities. But most importantly, I learned that successful intelligence work required being genuinely interested in other people's lives and perspectives. The most effective intelligence officers were those who approached their work with curiosity and respect, rather than suspicion and manipulation. Phase 4. Operational Deployment Preparation. The final phase focused on preparing us for real-world operations. We learned advanced security protocols, emergency procedures, and the legal and ethical frameworks that governed intelligence activity. We studied the organizational structures of various intelligence agencies and learned how to work effectively within bureaucratic systems that prioritized security and precision above speed and innovation. We also learned about the personal costs of intelligence work. Guest speakers included veteran intelligence officers, who discussed the challenges of maintaining personal relationships while working in classified environments, the psychological stress of operating in dangerous situations, and the long-term career implications of choosing intelligence work over more conventional paths. One speaker, a former CIA officer named Rebecca Torres, gave us particularly valuable advice about maintaining perspective and personal integrity. Intelligence work, she said, can become addictive. The sense of importance, the access to classified information, the feeling that you're protecting national security, it can make regular life seem boring by comparison. But you need to remember that intelligence work is a tool for serving larger purposes, not an end in itself. If you lose sight of why you're doing this work, you'll eventually lose sight of how to do it ethically. Rebecca also talked about the importance of maintaining connections to people outside the intelligence community. The moment you start thinking that only people with security clearances can understand your work or your perspective, you've lost the ability to understand the people you're supposed to be protecting. Stay connected to normal life. Stay connected to normal people. Remember that the point of intelligence work is to make their lives safer and more secure. As our training neared its end, we were given individual assessments and career guidance based on our demonstrated strengths and interests. My assessment indicated exceptional skills in cross-cultural communication, pattern recognition, and relationship building, with recommendations for placement in either diplomatic security or military intelligence. The assessment also noted that my linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge made me particularly valuable for operations involving cultural mediation and conflict prevention. Exactly the kind of work I'd hoped to pursue. Colonel Mitchell, who'd recruited me from Georgia Tech, conducted my final interview. "Elena, you've exceeded expectations in every phase of training. You have the analytical skills, cultural knowledge, and personal qualities needed for highly sensitive intelligence work. The question now is where you want to apply those skills. What are my options? CIA, NSA, DIA, State Department Diplomatic Security, or direct assignment to military intelligence. Each agency has different missions, different organizational cultures, and different career paths. Which would give me the most opportunity to do the kind of cultural mediation work we've been training for? Probably DIA, Defense Intelligence. They handle intelligence for military operations, which means you'd work directly with field commanders who need cultural guidance for interacting with local population. You'd be deployed to active conflict zones, but you'd also have opportunities to prevent conflicts through improved cross-cultural understanding. That sounds like exactly what I want to do. Then let's make it happen. 3 weeks later, I graduated from the training program with a top-secret security clearance and orders to report to DIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. My parents attended the graduation ceremony, which was small and private but deeply meaningful. When my name was called to receive my certificate, my father stood and applauded just as he had at my college graduation, but this time, I could see in his face that he finally understood what I'd been working toward all these years. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. "Elena, I need to apologize to you." "For what?" "For not understanding what you were doing. For not recognizing that your language skills were preparation for something important. For making you feel like you had to hide your abilities instead of celebrating them." "Dad, you don't need to apologize. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect you by making you smaller. That was wrong. You were right to refuse to be smaller. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Mir, and I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished but for having the courage to become who you were meant to be." 2 weeks later, I began my career as a professional intelligence officer, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Cultural Analysis Division. My first assignment would take me to Afghanistan, where I would work with military commanders to improve communication between American forces and local tribal leaders. What I didn't know was that this assignment would lead to the most important operation of my career, one that would demonstrate the life-or-death importance of cultural understanding in modern warfare and establish my reputation as one of the most effective cultural advisors in the U.S. military. But that revelation was still months away, waiting for a moment when my linguistic skills and cultural knowledge would prevent a tragedy that could have changed the course of the war in Afghanistan. My first deployment took me to Forward Operating Base Chapman, in Khost Province, Afghanistan, a dusty collection of concrete barriers and prefabricated buildings that housed about 400 American soldiers and an assortment of intelligence analysts, cultural advisors, and diplomatic personnel. The base was strategically located near the Pakistan border, in an area where tribal loyalties shifted constantly and where misunderstanding local customs could literally be a matter of life and death. I arrived in October 2018 as part of a new initiative to embed cultural advisors directly with combat units. My official title was Cultural Analysis Specialist, but soldiers simply called me the translator, which wasn't entirely accurate but wasn't entirely wrong either. My commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel David Park, a career infantry officer who'd completed 3 previous deployments to Afghanistan, and had developed a healthy respect for the complexity of tribal politics in the region. Unlike some commanders who viewed cultural advisors as unnecessary overhead, Colonel Park understood that successful military operations required local cooperation, and local cooperation required cultural understanding. "Rodriguez," he said during my initial briefing, "your job is to help us avoid stepping on cultural landmines that could turn friendly tribes into hostile ones. You're not here to translate words, we have interpreters for that. You're here to translate meaning." My first week at FOB Chapman was spent observing how American forces interacted with local populations, and identifying areas where cultural misunderstandings might be creating unnecessary friction. What I found was both encouraging and concerning. The encouraging part was that most American soldiers genuinely wanted to help local communities and were trying to be respectful of Afghan customs. The concerning part was that they often didn't know what those customs were or how their actions might be interpreted within local cultural frameworks. For example, I observed a medical team providing free healthcare to women and children in a nearby village. The Americans saw this as humanitarian assistance that should generate goodwill, but they were scheduling appointments during times when local men were away tending livestock, which meant women had to travel to the base without male escort. In the local tribal context, this put the women in potentially compromising situations that could damage their reputations and create family conflicts. The solution was simple once the cultural context was understood: adjusting the schedule so that medical appointments coincided with times when male family members could escort the women, and providing separate entrance and waiting areas so that women wouldn't be seen in the same spaces as unrelated men. But it took someone with cultural knowledge to recognize that a well-intentioned medical program was inadvertently creating social problems for the people it was trying to help. My first major test came during my 3rd week at FOB Chapman. Intelligence reports indicated that a local tribal leader named Abdul Rahman was providing information to Taliban forces about American patrol routes and troop movement. The evidence was circumstantial but concerning. Taliban attacks were consistently occurring in areas where Rahman's tribe had traditional hunting and grazing rights, and the timing of attacks suggested advanced knowledge of American activities. Colonel Park was considering direct confrontation with Rahman, either through arrest or through public accusation that would force him to choose sides between American forces and the Taliban. Both approaches carried significant risks. Arresting a tribal leader without conclusive evidence could alienate his entire tribe, while public accusation could escalate a manageable situation into open conflict. Rodriguez, Colonel Park said, I need you to help me understand this situation from Rahman's perspective. Is he actively supporting the Taliban, or is something else going on? I requested permission to review all available intelligence on Rahman and his tribe, including intercepts of communications, reports from local informants, and records of previous interactions with American forces. What I found was a more complex situation than the initial intelligence reports suggested. Rahman was indeed in contact with Taliban forces, but the nature of those contacts was defensive rather than offensive. His tribe controlled traditional grazing areas that were strategically valuable to both American forces and Taliban fighters. Rather than actively supporting the Taliban, Rahman was trying to protect his people by providing limited information to both sides, warning Taliban forces when American patrols were approaching his territory, and warning American forces when Taliban fighters were using his territory for transit. In the tribal context, this wasn't betrayal, it was responsible leadership. Rahman was trying to keep his people alive by maintaining relationships with both sides of a conflict he hadn't chosen and couldn't control. The solution required understanding Rahman's position and offering him better alternatives for protecting his tribe. I recommended that Colonel Park approach Rahman not as a suspected Taliban collaborator, but as a tribal leader facing an impossible situation, who might welcome American support in exchange for reliable information about Taliban activities. Sir, I think Rahman is trying to thread the needle between two dangerous adversaries. If we can convince him that cooperation with American forces will provide better protection for his tribe than his current balancing act, we might be able to turn him into a genuine ally. How do we do that? We approach him with respect for his leadership position, acknowledge the difficult situation he's in, and offer concrete assistance that demonstrates our commitment to his tribe's welfare. Medical support, infrastructure improvements, protection from Taliban retaliation, things that show we understand his responsibilities as a tribal leader. Colonel Park authorized me to arrange a meeting with Rahman, but with strict security protocols and backup plans in case the situation went badly. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a village mosque where both American and tribal representatives would be protected by traditional hospitality rules. I served as both cultural advisor and interpreter, since the conversation required understanding, not just Rahman's words but the cultural context that shaped their meaning. Rahman was a man in his 50s, weathered by decades of conflict, but still carrying himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being respected and obeyed. He greeted us with formal courtesy but clear weariness. The conversation began with traditional expressions of respect and concern for each other's welfare. Ritualized politeness that might seem like empty formality to Americans, but actually served important social functions in establishing the tone and boundaries of the discussion. Colonel Park, following my briefing, opened by acknowledging Rahman's responsibility for protecting his people, and expressing American desire to support rather than undermine that responsibility. We understand that you face difficult choices, Colonel Park said, with me translating not just his words but the respectful tone that was essential to the message. We're not here to make those choices more difficult. We're here to see if we can work together to make them easier. Rahman's response was carefully diplomatic, but revealed important information about his perspective. The Americans are guests in our land, he said. Good guests are welcomed and protected, but guests who bring danger to their hosts create problems for everyone. The subtext was clear. Rahman was willing to cooperate with American forces, but only if that cooperation didn't increase the danger to his tribe. Over the course of a 2-hour conversation, we negotiated an arrangement that met everyone's needs. Rahman would provide intelligence about Taliban movements through his territory in exchange for American medical support for his tribe. Advance warning about military operations that might affect his people, and discreet protection from Taliban retaliation. The arrangement worked because it was based on understanding Rahman's cultural obligations and providing support that helped him fulfill those obligations rather than forcing him to violate them. Over the following months, Rahman's information proved accurate and valuable, leading to the disruption of several Taliban operations without direct combat. More importantly, His cooperation encouraged other tribal leaders to approach American forces with similar arrangements, creating a network of local allies that significantly improved security throughout the region. Colonel Park was pleased with the results, but I was more interested in what the experience had taught me about the practical applications of cultural analysis in military operations. "Rodriguez," he said during my quarterly evaluation, "what you did with Ramen, that's exactly why we need cultural advisors embedded with combat units. You prevented a situation that could have escalated into tribal warfare and turned a potential enemy into a reliable ally." "Sir, the most important part wasn't the linguistics or the cultural knowledge. It was taking the time to understand Ramen's perspective and figure out how to support his goals, rather than forcing him to choose between our goals and his responsibilities." Explain that. "Most cross-cultural conflicts happen because each side assumes the other side shares their priorities and worldview. Americans tend to think in terms of individual choice. We expected Raman to choose between supporting Americans or supporting Taliban. But Raman was thinking in terms of tribal survival. He was trying to protect his people, regardless of which outside forces were fighting for control of the region. So the solution was to align our interests with his tribal obligations, rather than forcing him to choose between them." Exactly. And that's only possible if you understand what those tribal obligations are, and why they matter more to him than abstract political loyalties. This experience established my reputation as someone who could navigate complex cultural situations and develop practical solutions to problems that might otherwise require military force. Over the remaining months of my deployment, I worked on similar situations with other tribal leaders, local government officials, and community groups throughout the region. But my most significant achievement in Afghanistan wasn't preventing a single conflict. It was developing a systematic approach to cultural analysis that could be taught to other military personnel and applied to similar situations in other theaters of operation. By the time my deployment ended, I had created training materials that were being used to prepare other cultural advisors for deployment throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. My techniques for building relationships with local leaders, analyzing cross-cultural communication patterns, and developing win-win solutions to cultural conflicts became standard procedures for units operating in culturally complex environments. When I returned to the United States, I was promoted to captain and assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's training division, where I would spend the next 2 years developing advanced cultural analysis curricula and training the next generation of military cultural advisors. But more importantly, my success in Afghanistan had established me as someone who could accomplish in months what traditionally took years, building trust and cooperation between American forces and local populations through patient cultural understanding, rather than force or intimidation. That reputation would soon lead to my most challenging assignment yet, one that would test everything I'd learned about cultural analysis and establish my credentials as one of the most effective intelligence officers in the U.S. What I didn't know was that this assignment would also put me in the same room as my father for the first time since beginning my intelligence career, leading to a moment of recognition that would forever change how he thought about the daughter he'd once told was wasting her time learning languages. 2 years after returning from Afghanistan, I was assigned to what would become the most significant operation of my career. The briefing came on a Tuesday morning in January 2021, delivered by a stern-faced colonel, who spoke in the kind of measured tones that indicated classified information of the highest importance. "Captain Rodriguez, you're being assigned to Operation Linguistic Bridge, a joint operation involving multiple agencies and international partners. The mission is sensitive, time-critical, and requires someone with your specific combination of skill." Operation Linguistic Bridge was a counter-terrorism initiative focused on disrupting a sophisticated network of extremist groups that were coordinating activities across multiple countries using an intricate system of coded communications in various languages and dialects. What made this network particularly dangerous was their ability to exploit cultural and linguistic differences between American intelligence agencies and their international partners, using miscommunication and cultural misunderstanding as operational security. The network's communication strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They used different languages and cultural contexts for different aspects of their operations, knowing that most intelligence agencies specialized in specific regions and languages. A message might begin in Arabic, continue in Urdu, include coded references that only made sense within Pashtun cultural context, and conclude with instructions in a Somali dialect. By the time various agencies had translated and analyzed different portions of the communication, critical time had been lost and operational security had been compromised. My role was to serve as the primary cultural and linguistic analyst responsible for providing real-time interpretation of intercepted communications, identifying cultural contexts that other analysts might miss, and coordinating with international partners to ensure that cross-cultural collaboration remained effective under pressure. The operation was headquartered at a classified facility outside Washington, D.C., and involved analysts from CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, and intelligence agencies from 6 allied countries. The international component was crucial because the terrorist network was operating across borders, but it also created challenges since different agencies had different protocols, priorities, and cultural perspectives on intelligence sharing. My first week on the operation involved briefings with representatives from each participating agency, learning their analytical methodologies and understanding how cultural differences between agencies might create communication problems similar to those we were trying to prevent in the terrorist network. The British representatives approached intelligence analysis with methodical precision, building comprehensive dossiers before drawing conclusions. The Israelis preferred rapid assessment and immediate action, sometimes making decisions based on limited information rather than waiting for complete analysis. The Germans emphasized technological solutions and systematic data processing. The French insisted on maintaining clear hierarchical chains of command and formal protocols for information sharing. Each approach had advantages, but coordinating between them required constant cultural translation to ensure that different analytical styles didn't create miscommunication or missed opportunities. Rodriguez, said Major General Patricia Williams, the operations commanding officer, your job is to be the interpreter not just for terrorist communications, but for our own team communication. Make sure we don't defeat ourselves through cultural misunderstanding while we're trying to defeat the enemy through cultural understanding. The breakthrough came during my third week on the operation. We'd been tracking a series of communications that seemed to be coordinating a major operation, but the messages were fragmented across multiple languages and cultural contexts in ways that made comprehensive analysis extremely difficult. Different agencies were analyzing different pieces of the puzzle, but no one had been able to assemble the complete picture. The first message, intercepted by NSA, was in Arabic, but used Egyptian dialect with some unusual grammatical constructions that suggested the speaker was not a native Egyptian Arabic speaker. The CIA had identified this as probably coming from a Palestinian Arabic speaker trying to disguise his origin by using Egyptian dialect. The second message, intercepted by German intelligence, was in Urdu but included several Pashto words and cultural references that suggested familiarity with Afghan tribal customs. The Germans had focused on the Urdu content, but hadn't fully analyzed the cultural significance of the Pashto element. The third message, intercepted by French intelligence, was in Somali but included references to the Brothers from the Eastern Mountains and the Friends of the New Moon, phrases that didn't make sense in Somali cultural context, but might be meaningful in other traditions. Each agency had analyzed the messages individually and reached different conclusions about their significance. The Americans thought they indicated planning for operations in the Middle East. The Germans suspected coordination with Taliban-affiliated groups in Afghanistan. The French believed they were related to Somali piracy activities in the Horn of Africa. I requested copies of all 3 messages, and spent an entire night analyzing them, not as separate communications but as parts of a single coordinated plan. What I found was that the messages were using a sophisticated cultural code that exploited the fact that different intelligence agencies would analyze them separately. The unusual grammatical constructions in the Arabic message weren't mistakes. They were intentional signals that would be meaningless to Arabic speakers, but would convey specific information to speakers of other languages who understood the grammatical patterns being referenced. The Pashto words in the Urdu message weren't random cultural references, they were geographic indicators that specified locations, using traditional Afghan geographic terminology that wouldn't be recognized by people unfamiliar with tribal boundary definition. The Somali phrases that didn't make sense in Somali context made perfect sense when translated into Arabic and interpreted within Islamic calendar traditions. The Brothers from the Eastern Mountains referred to fighters from Afghanistan, and the Friends of the New Moon indicated timing based on lunar calendar calculations. When analyzed as a single communication system, The three messages revealed coordination between extremist groups in three different countries for a synchronized operation timed to coincide with a specific religious holiday and involving simultaneous attacks on Western targets in multiple locations. I presented my analysis to the Joint Intelligence Team at an emergency briefing that included representatives from all participating agencies. The terrorist network isn't just using multiple languages for operational security, I explained. They're using cultural and linguistic differences between our agencies as part of their communications strategy. They know that Arabic specialists won't fully understand Pashto cultural references, that Urdu speakers might not recognize Somali linguistic patterns, and that different agencies will analyze fragments of their communications without coordinating comprehensive interpretation. Major General Williams leaned forward. Are you saying they're deliberately exploiting our organizational structure? Yes, ma'am. And it's working because we've been approaching this as three separate intelligence problems instead of one integrated communication system. The solution required unprecedented coordination between agencies and cultural specialists. We established a real-time translation and cultural analysis center where intercepted communications could be analyzed simultaneously by specialists in all relevant languages and cultural contexts, with findings immediately shared between all participating agencies. Over the following weeks, this integrated approach allowed us to map the entire terrorist network, identify key operational leaders, and track planning for what would have been the largest coordinated terrorist attack since. The operation culminated in simultaneous raids in 7 countries that disrupted the network and prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. More importantly, the success demonstrated the effectiveness of cultural analysis as a tool for modern intelligence operations and established new protocols for international intelligence cooperation. My role in Operation Linguistic Bridge earned me promotion to major and assignment to the newly created Cultural Intelligence Division, where I would lead efforts to develop systematic approaches to cross-cultural analysis for intelligence operations. But the professional recognition was less important to me than the personal satisfaction of knowing that my linguistic skills and cultural knowledge had been used to prevent genuine tragedy. The languages my father had once called useless had literally saved lives. What I didn't know was that news of Operation Linguistic Bridge's success had reached the highest levels of military leadership, and that my role in the operation had earned me recognition that would soon put me in the same room as my father for the first time since beginning my intelligence career. The invitation to the recognition ceremony at Fort Bragg arrived with a note that the event would honor personnel whose innovative approaches to intelligence analysis had significantly enhanced national security. Family members were invited to attend. I sent the invitation to my parents with a note that I'd be receiving some kind of recognition for my work, though I couldn't provide details about the specific operation involved. My father's response was brief: "Proud of you, we'll be there." What neither of us knew was that this ceremony would become the moment when he finally understood that all those years of studying languages hadn't been preparation for an academic career or a cultural hobby. They'd been preparation for becoming exactly the kind of soldier he'd always claimed to respect. The recognition ceremony at Fort Bragg was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March. I arrived 2 days early for preliminary briefings and protocol meetings, staying in visiting officer quarters on base. The ceremony was being held in the main auditorium, a formal space that could accommodate several hundred attendees including military personnel, family members, and distinguished guests. I knew my parents would be in the audience, but I didn't know exactly where they'd be seated or whether I'd have opportunity to speak with them before the formal program began. The nature of the recognition was still unclear to me. I knew it was related to Operation Linguistic Bridge. The specific format and scope of the ceremony had been kept deliberately vague for security reasons. My father arrived in his dress uniform, even though he'd been retired for 3 years. It was the first time I'd seen him in uniform since my college graduation, and the sight of him walking across the base with the bearing and confidence of someone who belonged there reminded me why I'd been so determined to prove myself worthy of his respect. My mother wore the navy blue dress she reserved for special occasions, and I could see her nervousness in the way she kept checking her watch and adjusting her purse strap. She'd never been comfortable on military bases, even after 28 years of marriage to a soldier, but she was here because her daughter was being honored, and that mattered more than her discomfort. The ceremony began with standard military protocol: presentation of colors, national anthem, invocation, and remarks by the base commander about the importance of recognizing exceptional service. The audience included about 300 people, mostly military personnel and their families, along with some civilians who I assumed were government officials or contractors with security clearances. For the first 30 minutes, it was a typical military recognition ceremony. Individual soldiers were called forward to receive various awards for distinguished service, leadership excellence, and operational achievements. Each recognition included a brief description of the recipient's accomplishments, applause, and a photo opportunity with senior officer. I was listed in the program as Captain Elena Rodriguez, Defense Intelligence Agency, with no additional details about my specific role or achievements. This wasn't unusual. Intelligence awards often involved classified operations that couldn't be described publicly. When my name was called, I expected to walk forward, receive a medal or certificate, and return to my seat after brief remarks about the importance of intelligence analysis in modern military operation. Instead, the presenter, a colonel I didn't recognize, invited me to stand but asked me to remain in place while he provided additional context for my recognition. Captain Rodriguez represents a new model of intelligence officer, he began, one whose linguistic abilities and cultural expertise have proven essential for operations in our increasingly complex global environment. Her work has prevented international incidents, saved lives, and demonstrated the critical importance of cross-cultural understanding in modern warfare. I was still standing in the audience, wondering when I would be invited to the stage, when a side door opened and Lieutenant General James Morrison walked to the podium. General Morrison was the commander of U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, one of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in the military. His presence at the ceremony indicated that whatever recognition I was about to receive was more significant than I'd been led to believe. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison said, "today we recognize an officer whose innovative approach to intelligence analysis has changed how we think about cultural intelligence and international cooperation. Captain Rodriguez's work on Operation Linguistic Bridge prevented what could have been the largest terrorist attack on American interests since September 11, 2001. I felt my stomach tighten. This was the first time Operation Linguistic Bridge had been mentioned publicly, even in general terms. But more than preventing a specific attack, General Morrison continued, Captain Rodriguez has demonstrated that cultural understanding and linguistic expertise are not auxiliary skills that support military operations. They are core competencies that can determine the success or failure of our most important missions. The general paused and looked directly at me. Captain Rodriguez, your work represents the future of intelligence operation. You have shown that understanding people is just as important as understanding technology, that cultural bridges can be more powerful than military force, and that the ability to communicate across cultural boundaries is itself a form of national security. Then he said the 6 words that changed everything: we need polyglot in the room. The audience was quiet, not understanding the significance of the operational name, but I felt my knees almost buckle. Polyglot was my classified operational designation, known only to people with the highest levels of security clearance. It had never been spoken in a public setting. The fact that General Morrison was using it meant that my identity as a key intelligence asset was being officially acknowledged for the first time. I looked around the room and found my father's face in the audience. His expression had changed from polite attention to focused intensity, the look he got when he was trying to process information that didn't fit his existing understanding of a situation. General Morrison continued, polyglot is the operational designation for Captain Rodriguez, reflecting her unique ability to serve as a linguistic and cultural bridge in complex international operations. This designation represents not just language skills, but the rare combination of analytical intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and operational effectiveness that makes the difference between mission success and mission failure. I walked to the front of the auditorium, my mind racing through the implications of having my operational identity revealed publicly. This level of recognition was unprecedented and indicated that my role in Operation Linguistic Bridge had been more significant than I'd realized. When I reached the podium, General Morrison presented me with the Defense Intelligence Agency Director's Award, the highest recognition given to intelligence officers for exceptional analytical work. But more importantly, he spoke directly about the nature of my contributions. Captain Rodriguez, your ability to think across cultural boundaries, to understand the perspectives of people from different backgrounds, and to facilitate communication between groups that might otherwise misunderstand each other. These skills have proven essential for modern intelligence operations. You have shown that building bridges is just as important as gathering intelligence, and that understanding people is the key to protecting them. The applause was sustained and genuine, but I was focused on my father's face. He was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not pride, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time. After the ceremony, there was a reception where family members could meet with the honored person. My parents approached me cautiously, and I could see that my father was struggling to process what he'd just heard. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to understand something. When General Morrison called you polyglot, that's your actual job title. It's my operational designation. It means I'm certified to work on the most sensitive cultural analysis operations. And this Operation Linguistic Bridge, you were the primary analyst?" "I was the lead cultural interpreter. My job was to analyze terrorist communications that were using multiple languages and cultural codes to avoid detection." My father was quiet for a long moment. "And you prevented a terrorist attack?" "I identified patterns that other analysts had missed because they were analyzing fragments of communications instead of looking at the complete cultural context." "How many people could have died if you hadn't figured this out?" I looked around the reception room, aware that we were discussing classified information in a public setting. "Dad, I can't give you specific details, but it would have been significant." My father sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "Elena, for 26 years I've been telling you that learning languages was a waste of time, that you should focus on practical skills that could help you build a career." "I know, Dad, but what you just described, preventing terrorist attacks by understanding cultural communication patterns, that's not a hobby, that's not even just a job, that's—" He stopped, looking for the right words. "That's exactly the kind of work that matters most," my mother said gently. "The kind of work that protects people without them ever knowing they needed protection." My father looked up at me. "Elena, I owe you an apology, not just for not understanding what you were doing, but for making you feel like you had to hide it from me, for making you think that your abilities weren't valuable." "Dad, you don't need to apologize. You were trying to help me choose a safe, practical career path. But I was wrong. What you do, it's more important than anything I ever did in my 30 years in the Army. I spent my career following orders and executing missions that other people planned. You spend your career preventing the need for those missions in the first place." The conversation continued for another hour, with my father asking detailed questions about my career path, my training, and my work. For the first time, he was genuinely curious about my linguistic abilities rather than dismissive of them. But the most significant moment came when we were preparing to leave. "Elena," he said, "I want you to know something. When General Morrison said those 6 words, 'We need polyglot in the room,' I finally understood what you've been trying to tell me for years." "What's that?" "You weren't just learning languages, you were becoming someone who could use those languages to make the world safer. Someone who could build bridges between people who might otherwise see each other as enemies." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I spent my whole life trying to fit in, trying to prove that I belonged in America by minimizing everything that made me different. But you've built a career by celebrating what makes you different, and using those differences to serve your country. Dad, both approaches have value. Your generation had different challenges. Maybe, but Elena, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just for your achievements, but for having the courage to become exactly who you were meant to be, even when I was too afraid to encourage you." That evening we had dinner together at a restaurant near the base. For the first time in my adult life, my father asked me to tell him about my work, not because he was worried about my safety or skeptical about my choices, but because he was genuinely interested in understanding what I did and how I'd learned to do it so effectively. I told him about my year in Jordan, about my training at Fort Belvoir, about my deployment to Afghanistan, and about the cultural analysis techniques I'd developed for intelligence operations. I explained how different languages provided different frameworks for understanding the world, and how cultural knowledge could be more valuable than technical surveillance in certain situations. "Elena," he said as we were finishing dinner, "I have one more question. Are you happy? I mean, really happy with the career you've chosen?" I thought about the question seriously. "Dad, I wake up every morning knowing that my work matters. I use abilities I've spent my entire life developing. I solve problems that protect people who will never know their lives were in danger. I get to travel the world, work with brilliant people, and constantly learn new things." That sounds like a yes. It's definitely a yes. My father smiled. "Then I guess all those years of studying languages in your bedroom weren't a waste of time after all." "No, Dad, they were preparation for exactly this." The recognition ceremony at Fort Bragg marked a turning point, not just in my relationship with my father, but in my entire career trajectory. Being publicly acknowledged as polyglot elevated my profile within the intelligence community and led to opportunities I hadn't anticipated. Within 2 weeks of the ceremony, I received orders to report to the Pentagon for assignment to a newly created position, Director of Cultural Intelligence Integration. The role involved developing standardized cultural analysis protocols for all branches of military intelligence, training senior officers in cross-cultural communication strategies, and serving as a liaison between American intelligence agencies and their international partners. It was a significant promotion. I would be working at the highest levels of military intelligence, reporting directly to the Defense Intelligence Agency Director, and influencing policy decisions that affected intelligence operations worldwide. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with my father. The week after the ceremony, he called me every evening to ask about my work, not because he was worried or skeptical but because he was genuinely curious about the field he'd spent years dismissing as impractical. "Elena," he said during one of these conversations, "I've been reading about cultural intelligence online. There are universities offering degree programs specifically in this field now. It's becoming recognized as a legitimate academic discipline." I told him, "There's growing awareness that cultural understanding is essential for everything from business negotiations to diplomatic relations to military operations. And you were studying this before it had a name." I was following my interest. I got lucky that those interests turned out to be professionally valuable. "Luck had nothing to do with it," my father said firmly. "You saw something important that other people were missing. You developed skills that other people didn't think were important. You were ahead of your time." These conversations helped me understand that my father's skepticism about my language learning hadn't been personal criticism, it had been protective anxiety. As an immigrant who'd spent his adult life proving his belonging in American society, he'd been terrified that his daughter would pursue interests that might mark her as too different, too foreign, too unconventional to succeed. "Misha," he said during one particularly honest conversation, "when you were young and spending all your time with those language books, I was scared that you were making yourself unemployable. I thought companies would see speaks 9 languages on a resume and think weird instead of valuable. But you were wrong about that." I was wrong about a lot of things. But Elena, I need you to understand. I wasn't wrong because I was stupid or narrow-minded. I was wrong because the world was changing faster than I realized. When I was your age, speaking multiple languages was something that marked you as foreign. Now it's something that marks you as globally competent. This insight helped me appreciate the generational differences that had shaped our conflict. My father had navigated his career during a period when success for immigrants often required cultural assimilation and minimizing differences. I was building my career during a period when cultural diversity and cross-cultural competence were increasingly valued as strategic advantages. Dad, both of our approaches made sense for our respective times. You succeeded by fitting in when that was necessary for survival. I succeeded by standing out when that became valuable for advancement. But Elena, the important thing is that you had the courage to stand out even when I was telling you to fit in. You were right to trust your instincts instead of my fear. My new position at the Pentagon involved substantial travel, working with intelligence agencies in allied countries to develop common frameworks for cultural analysis and cross-cultural cooperation. These assignments took me to London, Tel Aviv, Berlin, Paris, and Tokyo, where I worked with intelligence professionals who were dealing with similar challenges of cultural understanding in global operation. What I discovered was that the United States was actually ahead of most other countries in recognizing the importance of cultural intelligence for military and diplomatic operations. Many of our allies were still approaching intelligence work through purely technical or linguistic frameworks, without the cultural analysis components that had proven so valuable in American operations. This gave me opportunities to serve not just as a cultural analyst, but as a cultural intelligence evangelist, helping other countries understand how cultural knowledge could enhance their own intelligence capabilities. The work was professionally satisfying, but it also provided perspective on my own career development. I realized that my combination of linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and analytical training had positioned me to be a pioneer in a field that was still emerging. I wasn't just doing cultural intelligence work, I was helping to define what cultural intelligence work could become. 1 year after the Fort Bragg ceremony, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to lead the newly created International Cultural Intelligence Cooperation Initiative. a program designed to standardize cultural analysis practices across NATO intelligence agencies. The assignment involved managing a team of cultural analysts from 12 different countries, coordinating research projects, and developing training programs that could be implemented across different cultural and organizational contexts. Leading an international team presented fascinating challenges. My team included a British anthropologist who specialized in Middle Eastern tribal structures, a German psychologist who studied cross-cultural communication patterns, a French historian who analyzed religious influences on political movements, an Israeli linguist who worked on Arabic dialect identification, and a Canadian sociologist who focused on immigration and cultural integration issues. Each team member brought different cultural perspectives on intelligence work itself. The British favored methodical, comprehensive analysis. The Germans emphasized systematic data collection and processing. The French insisted on theoretical frameworks and historical context. The Israelis preferred rapid assessment and actionable recommendations. The Canadians focused on collaborative decision-making and consensus building. Managing these different approaches required applying cultural intelligence principles to my own team management, understanding how different cultural backgrounds influenced analytical preferences, and finding ways to combine different methodological strengths, rather than forcing everyone to adopt a single approach. The experience taught me that cultural intelligence wasn't just useful for understanding foreign populations, it was essential for managing international cooperation and building effective multicultural teams. 2 years into this assignment, I received an unexpected phone call from my father. "Elena, I have something to tell you that I probably should have told you years ago." "What's that?" "I've been following your career through military news sources and professional publications. I've been reading articles about cultural intelligence and seeing your name mentioned as one of the leading experts in the field. You've been following my career in professional publications. Elena, you're making a name for yourself, not just within the military but in academic circles, policy think tanks, and international organizations. People are writing about your work." I was surprised by this. I'd been focused on the day-to-day requirements of my assignments, and hadn't been paying attention to external recognition. "What kind of articles?" Foreign Affairs magazine published a piece about the importance of cultural intelligence in modern diplomacy and cited your work on Operation Linguistic Bridge. The Brookings Institution published a policy paper on improving international intelligence cooperation and recommended your training protocols for NATO adoption. Harvard's Kennedy School included your cultural analysis methodology in their curriculum for future diplomats. I realized I'd been so focused on the operational aspects of my work that I hadn't considered its broader academic and policy implications. "Dad, I had no idea any of that was happening." "Elena, you're not just succeeding in your career, you're influencing how people think about international relations, military cooperation, and cultural understanding. You're helping to shape policy at the highest levels." That conversation prompted me to pay more attention to the external impact of my work. Over the following months, I received invitations to speak at academic conferences, contribute to policy publications, and consult with government agencies on cultural intelligence initiatives. I discovered that my practical experience in cultural analysis had positioned me to bridge the gap between academic theory and operational application. University researchers were interested in my field experience, while policymakers were interested in my analytical frameworks, and military professionals were interested in my training methodology. This recognition led to my most significant career opportunity yet, an invitation to serve as the first director of the newly created Global Cultural Intelligence Center, a joint initiative involving the Department of Defense, the State Department, and several major universities. The position would involve overseeing research into cultural intelligence methodologies, developing training programs for government employees and military personnel, and coordinating with international partners on cultural analysis initiatives. It was essentially an opportunity to institutionalize the work I'd been doing for the past decade and ensure that cultural intelligence became a permanent component of American national security strategy. When I told my father about this opportunity, his response surprised me. "Elena, this sounds like exactly what you were preparing for your entire life. All those years of learning languages, all that training in cultural analysis, all your experience in the field, it's all been leading to this moment." "I never had a master plan, Dad. I was just following my interests and trying to be good at whatever opportunities came my way. Maybe. But Elena, sometimes following your interests consistently over many years creates opportunities that look like master plans in retrospect. Do you think I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But Elena, I want you to know something. I'm proud of you not just for your achievements, but for having the vision to see possibilities that other people missed, and the persistence to develop capabilities that other people didn't think were important. Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me. And Elena? Yeah. The next time someone tells you that learning languages is a waste of time, you tell them to call your old man. I'll set them straight. 3 months later, I accepted the position as director of the Global Cultural Intelligence Center, beginning a new phase of my career that would involve not just applying cultural intelligence principles to specific operations, but building institutional frameworks that would ensure cultural understanding remained a priority for American national security for decades to come. The little girl who had hidden language textbooks under her mattress had become one of the leading experts in a field that hadn't existed when she started learning her first foreign language. But the most important transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. My father had evolved from someone who saw my linguistic abilities as problematic differences, to someone who understood them as strategic advantages. And I had evolved from someone who felt she had to choose between family acceptance and personal authenticity, to someone who understood that the best family relationships are built on mutual respect for each other's authentic self. The ceremony at Fort Bragg had been about professional recognition, but its lasting impact was relational, proving that it's never too late for family members to truly see each other and that understanding, like linguistic ability, can be developed through patient practice and genuine commitment to bridging differences. 5 years have passed since that ceremony at Fort Bragg, and I'm writing this account from my office at the Global Cultural Intelligence Center in Washington, D.C. The walls are lined with maps, cultural artifacts from dozens of countries, and photos from training programs and international conferences. But the most prominent decoration is a framed photo from the Fort Bragg ceremony, my father in his dress uniform, standing at attention as General Morrison presented me with the DIA Director's Award. The Global Cultural Intelligence Center has grown from a small experimental program to a major component of American national security infrastructure. We now train over 2,000 military personnel and government employees annually in cultural analysis techniques. Our research has influenced policy decisions in conflicts from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. Our international cooperation programs have improved intelligence sharing between allied countries and prevented numerous diplomatic misunderstandings that could have escalated into serious conflict. But the most satisfying aspect of my current role is training the next generation of cultural intelligence officers. Every month I meet with young recruits who remind me of myself at 18, bright, curious, multilingual, and uncertain whether their unusual combination of interests could translate into meaningful career. Last week I met with a young sergeant named Michael Chen, who speaks Mandarin, Korean, Japanese, and Arabic, and who's interested in cultural analysis, but worried that his academic background in computer science makes him unsuitable for intelligence work. "Ma'am," he said, "I love learning languages and I'm fascinated by cultural differences, but I'm not sure if someone with a technical background can succeed in cultural intelligence." I smiled, remembering my own uncertainties about combining linguistic interests with practical career requirements. Sergeant Chen, some of our most effective cultural analysts are people who combine technical skills with cultural knowledge. Modern intelligence operations require understanding both digital communications and cultural context. Your computer science background isn't a liability, it's an additional asset. Really? The future of cultural intelligence involves analyzing social media patterns, understanding how different cultures use technology for communication, and developing digital tools for cultural analysis. Someone who understands both technology and culture has advantages that people with only one type of knowledge can't match. These conversations remind me how much the field has evolved since I began my career. Cultural intelligence is no longer an experimental specialty, it's a recognized professional discipline, with clear career paths, standardized training programs, and growing demand across government, military, and private sector organizations. But they also remind me how important it is for young people to have mentors who encourage their unusual interests rather than discouraging them as impractical. My relationship with my father has continued to deepen as he's become genuinely interested in my work and its broader implications. He reads everything I publish, attends my public speaking events whenever possible, and has become one of my most knowledgeable advocates for the importance of cultural intelligence in modern international relations. 6 months ago, he attended a conference where I gave a presentation on cultural intelligence as a tool for conflict prevention. After my presentation, during the question and answer period, an audience member asked whether cultural intelligence was really practical for everyday military operations, or whether it was more of an academic concept with limited field application. Before I could respond, my father stood up from the audience. "If I may," he said, "I'd like to answer that question as someone who spent 30 years in the army without understanding what cultural intelligence could accomplish." I was surprised. My father had never spoken at one of my professional events before. My daughter prevented a major terrorist attack by understanding cultural communication patterns that other analysts had missed. She's trained hundreds of military personnel to build relationships with local populations instead of fighting them. She's helped prevent diplomatic incidents that could have escalated into international conflicts. "If that's not practical enough for you, I don't know what would." The audience applauded, and I realized that my father had become not just supportive of my career, but an active advocate for the field I'd helped to create. After the conference, I asked him why he'd decided to speak up. "Elena, for too many years, I didn't understand the value of what you were doing. I don't want other people to make the same mistake I made. Cultural intelligence isn't just important, it's essential for anyone who wants to work effectively in our globalized world." "Dad, you don't need to feel guilty about your initial skepticism. You were working with the information and experience you had at the time. Maybe, but Elena, I've learned something from watching your career develop. The most important innovations often come from people who pursue unusual interests that other people don't immediately understand. If we discourage young people from exploring unconventional paths, we might be preventing the next breakthrough in cultural intelligence or diplomacy or international relations." This insight has influenced how I approach my current role as a mentor and trainer. Instead of focusing only on students who already know they want careers in cultural intelligence, I actively recruit people with diverse backgrounds and unusual combinations of interests.